Okay, so idealism only makes sense if consciousness is not some kind of basic stuff, but simply being itself, being presence. In other words, consciousness is the presence of the present, the there-ness of whatever happens to be there. Consciousness is not a stuff, it is the presence of stuff, of all kinds of stuff. Idealism also only makes sense if the things of the world, that which is present, if the things of the world are understood to be between us rather than inside various different container-like subjects. So clearly we share a world and we discuss the same objects. If consciousness if we understand consciousness as presence or being, and entities are understood to be between subjects rather than within them, we end up with perspectivism in the strong ontological sense. In other words, the idealism that works, a mature idealism, is perspectivism. And you basically find this in Ortega, and you could say that Leibniz foreshadows this. And I would say that Schrodinger's aspects of the one is already a mature version of this. So Schrodinger, Ortega, and I would even say that Heidegger are perspectivist. Ortega is explicitly a perspectivist. Of course, Nietzsche, he plays with the idea. Heidegger is not often understood as a perspectivist, but I think it's implicit in his work. You could see what he writes about Leibniz in Basic Problems of Phenomenology. Okay, so can we make this work? If the very being of the physical entity is the consciousness of a plurality of subjects, then the physical entity is fragmented. The physical entity is fragmented. So if perspectivism is ontological, if perspectivism is not merely epistemic, if perspective goes all the way down, if, as Ortega says, perspective is fundamental, then the physical entity is fragmented. It is shattered into what you might call its aspects, its adumbrations, or its moments. So you could say that a thing is a system of faces. There's nothing behind these faces. There is just this system of faces. So you have the different faces or aspects of the thing and their unification. You can also find this in Sartre near the beginning of Being and Nothingness. That was a big influence on me personally. It's kind of on the margins of philosophy. Okay, so for instance, the being of the couch we both sit on is its presence for you, right? The total experience of the couch, the softness of the couch, maybe it's red, the redness. Now this softness or redness, it's there. It's the being of the softness or the redness, and so it's the presence for you, the presence for me, as well as its actual and possible presence for others. So the real couch, it does not exist. The couch does not have its being in some magical aperspectival realm. The couch is fragmented into all the different ways that the couch appears for actual and possible experiencers, perceivers, or subjects. Now the subject turns out to be, if you really want to make this work, you can say that the deep subject really is just a face of the world. Like consciousness is a kind of nothingness, right? Consciousness is being, is the presence of the present. So consciousness is not a kind of stuff. In the deep subject, you might say the ontological ego is not a thing at all, but merely the perspectival presence of all the other things in the world. So while it is incorrect to claim that the world is made of consciousness, it is correct to claim that the world is always and only world for, or world from point of view. And there's an important difference there. So Panin experientialism is an unripe perspectivism, since it understands experience or consciousness as a kind of stuff. It misses the ontological difference. But Panin experientialism as a neutral monism is a relatively mature idealism. We could say that the maturity of an idealism, the sophistication of an idealism, is understood here as its distance from dualism. So what you have is crude forms of idealism and crude forms of physicalism. They stay pretty close to dualism. They have this residue of dualism. And what they do is they privilege one side of the traditional dualism. And they don't know what to do with the remainder. That's the tricky part. So if you try to escape from dualism into physicalism, then you have this so-called hard problem of consciousness. Okay, so neutral monism, in Pannin experientialism, at least on the surface, right? It's a neutral monism. There's one type of stuff, right? It does escape from two-substance dualism, but it still misunderstands being, presence, or experience or consciousness as a present raw material, as a kind of stuff, right? If you still think that consciousness is a kind of stuff, then you're thinking that consciousness is a sort of wood or goo that other things are made out of. But being is not a kind of stuff. As Thales once claimed that all is water, the neutral monist claims that all is X, where X is perhaps experience. It really doesn't matter what X is. Because if everything is X, you might as well say nothing is X. Categories are only meaningful if they differentiate. So, in idealism, we're trying to make idealism work. We're trying to rescue idealism, or we're trying to juice idealism for what is correct in it, right? Experience in such a context, or consciousness in such a context, it's intended in the first place to have no other. Therefore, the category is empty. So as a category for entities, experience is useless in this framework, because all entities are supposed to be made of experience. So the category is worthless. And this is perhaps why William James, sometimes understood as a Pannin experientialist, called himself a radical pluralist. So I claim that this is the most mature form, radical pluralism. Perspectivism gives you radical pluralism. So if consciousness is presence or being itself, then the entities that are present can be, and indeed are, provisionally categorized in all kinds of ways. There's all kinds of things, right? No kind of thing, no category is absolute or special. So idealism is often understood as the claim that the world is essentially mind. But crude versions of idealism fail. To say that all is mind or all is physical, it's a trivial statement. It's a form of cheerleading. An expression of feeling. Now, I'm not saying it's worthless on that account, but I'm saying that no logical cognitive work is being done. You could defend it and say, okay, I know that dualism is unstable, so I'm trying to move to a neutral monism, and that is an improvement. So I say that neutral monism is an improvement, but it's not a place to rest. So I say that the real gist of idealism, what the idealist should be saying, or maybe even wants to say, is that perspective is absolute. In other words, reality is only first person. And this is also in Ortega. We don't know what reality from no perspective looks like. So you could say that this kind of idealistic perspectivism is phenomenological. It's even sort of logical positivist. And of course, I often call this phenomenalism. Now, just as a side note, I think phenomenalism is related to idealism, but it makes the world, it gives the world such priority. Some people have said it's a radical kind of realism, because objects have this new vividness. It's very far from subjective idealism, because physical objects have their being splintered into aspects, right? If the objects are between us, then this is not like subjective idealism where, it's all my dream. Because logically, you have a piece, you are, in some sense, you are a piece or aspect of the couch. And I have or am a different piece or aspect of the couch. Or the apple, I use the apple in this example. So if physical objects have their being splintered or fragmented into aspects, then the apple exists as the apple for Mary, the apple for Joe, and so on. But logically, we do have the apple, one and the same apple. You see, that's the problem to be solved, and I think it's already been solved. So the fragmented apple, as a system of fragments or faces, is unified logically. Now this, I would say this is phenomenological. I just say that we just do talk about the same objects, and you can make a case for this. If we can't talk about the same objects, we can't even do philosophy. So you can be a radical skeptic, but then you don't even show up to bother because you don't even have faith that you can talk about the same world with other people. So that's the quick case I would make for saying that we just are able to talk about the same objects. And yet I think if we just look at experience, we have always the apple from this or that perspective, for Joe, for Mary, for the cat, for the alien, who knows? So you could say that the apple is kind of like an open system of fragments, an open system of aspects. Okay, so we intend and discuss the same objects whose being is otherwise fragmented. So instead of like a real apple that is hidden behind all of these fragments as their secret cause, the apple has no official face. The apple is its logically unified system of faces. Or you could say the apple is an ideal manifold of its manifestations.